From the Caves and Jungles of Hindustan by Madame Blavatsky, Chapter 6, Part 2. After many nights spent in a tent, it is more than agreeable to sleep in a regular bed, even if it's only a hanging one. The pleasure would no doubt have been considerably increased had I but known I was resting on the couch of a god. But this latter circumstance was revealed to me only in the morning, when descending the staircase I suddenly discovered the poor Général en Chef, Hanuman, deprived of his cradle and unceremoniously stowed away under the stairs. Decidedly, the Hindus of the 19th century are a degenerate and blaspheming race. In the course of the morning, we learned that this swinging throne of his and an ancient sofa were the only pieces of furniture in the whole house that could be transformed into beds. Neither of our gentlemen had spent a comfortable night. They slept in an empty tower that was once an altar of a decayed pagoda and was situated behind the main building. In assigning to them this strange resting place, the host was guided by the praiseworthy intention of protecting them from the jackals, which freely penetrate into the rooms of the ground floor, as they are pierced by numberless arches and have no door and no window frames. The jackals, however, did not trouble the gentlemen that night, except by giving their nightly concert. But both Mr. Y and the Colonel had to fight all night long with a vampire, which, besides being a flying fox of an unusual size, happened to be a spirit, as we learned too late, to our great misfortune. This is how it all happened. Noiselessly hovering about the tower, the vampire from time to time alighted on the sleepers, making them shudder under the disgusting touch of his cold, sticky fingers. His intention, clearly, was to get a nice suck of European blood. They were wakened from his manipulations at least 10 times, and each time frightened him away. But as soon as they were dozing again, the wretched bat was sure to return and perch on their shoulders, heads, or legs. At last, Mr. Y, losing patience, had recourse to strong measures. He caught him and broke his neck. Feeling perfectly innocent, the gentlemen mentioned the tragic end of the troublesome flying fox to their host, and instantly drew down on their heads all the thunderclouds of heaven. The yard was crowded with people. All the inhabitants of the house stood sorrowfully, drooping their heads at the entrance of the tower. Our host's old mother tore her hair in despair and shrieked lamentations in all languages of India. What was the matter with them all? We were at our wits' end, but when we learned the cause for all this, there was no limit to our confusion. By certain mysterious signs, known only to the family Brahmin, it had been decided 10 years ago that the soul of our host's elder brother had incarnated in this bloodthirsty vampire bat. This fact was stated as being beyond any doubt. For 9 years, the late Patara Prabhu, Prabhu, existed under this new shape, carrying out the laws of metempsychosis. He spent the hours between sunrise and sunset in an old pipal tree before the tower, hanging with his head downward. But at night he visited the old tower and gave fierce chase to the insects that sought rest in this out-of-the-way corner. And so 9 years were spent in this happy existence, divided between sleep, food, and the gradual redemption of old sins committed in the shape of a Patara Prabhu. And now his listless body lay in the dust at the entrance of his favorite tower, and his wings were half devoured by the rats. The poor old woman, his mother, was mad with sorrow and cast, through her tears, reproachful, angry looks at Mr. Y, who, in his new capacity of a heartless murderer, looked disgustingly composed. But the affair was growing serious. The comical side of it disappeared before the sincerity and the intensity of her lamentations. Her descendants, grouped around her, were too polite to reproach us openly, but the expression of their faces was far from reassuring. The family priest and astrologer stood by the old lady, shastras in hand, ready to begin the ceremony of purification. He solemnly covered the corpse with a piece of new linen, and so hid from our eyes the sad remains on which the ants were literally swarming. Mr. Y did his best to look unconcerned, but still, when the tactless Miss X came to him expressing her loud indignation at all these superstitions of an inferior race, he at least seemed to remember that our host knew English perfectly, and he did not encourage her farther expressions of sympathy. He made no answer, but smiled contemptuously. Our host approached the colonel with respectful salams and invited us to follow him. No doubt he's going to ask us to leave his house immediately, was my uncomfortable impression. But my apprehension was not justified. At this epoch of my Indian pilgrimage, I was far as yet from having fathomed the metaphysical depth of a Hindu heart. Sham Rao, R-A-O, began by delivering a very far-fetched, eloquent preface. He reminded us that he personally was an enlightened man, a man who possessed all the advantages of a Western education. He said that owing to this, he was not quite sure that the body of the vampire was actually inhabited by his late brother. Darwin, of course, and some other great naturalists of the West seemed to believe in the transmigration of souls, but as far as he understood, they believed it in an inverse sense. That is to say, if a baby had been born to his mother exactly at the moment of the vampire's death, this baby would indubitably have had the great likeness to a vampire, owing to the decaying atoms of the vampire being so close to her. Is it not the exact interpretation of Darwinian school? He asked. We modestly answered that having traveled almost incessantly during the last year, we could not help being a bit behindhand in the questions of modern science, and that we were not able to follow his latest conclusions. But I have followed them, rejoined the good-natured Sham Rao, with a touch of pomposity, and so I hope I may be allowed to say that I have understood and duly appreciated their most recent developments. I have just finished studying the magnificent anthropogenesis of Haeckel, and have carefully discussed in my own mind his logical scientific explanations of the origin of man, from inferior animal forms through transformation. And what is this transformation? Pray, if not the transmigration of the ancient and modern Hindus and the metempsychosis of the Greeks? We had nothing to say against the identity, and even ventured to observe that according to Haeckel it does look like it. Exactly, exclaimed he joyfully. This shows that our conceptions are neither silly nor superstitious, as is maintained by some opponents of Manu. The great Manu anticipated Darwin and Haeckel. Judge for yourself. The latter derives the genesis of man from a group of plastids, from the jelly-like moneron. This moneron, through the amoeba, the ascidian, the brainless, heartless, amphioxus, and so transmigrates in the eighth, moves into the lamprey, is transformed at last into a vertebrate amniotote, into a pre-mammalian, into a marsupial animal. The vampire, in its turn, belongs to the species of vertebrates. You being well-read people, all of you, cannot contradict this statement. He was right in his supposition. We did not contradict it. in this case, do me the honor to follow my argument. We did follow his argument with the greatest attention, but we were at a loss to foresee whither it tended to lead us. Darwin, continued Shamrawa, Darwin, in his Origin of Species, re-established almost word for word the paleogenic teachings of our Manu. Of this I am perfectly convinced, and if you like, I can prove it to you, book in hand. Our ancient lawgiver, amongst other sayings, speaks as follows. The great Parabrahm commanded man to appear in the universe after traversing all the grades of the animal kingdom and springing primordially from the worm of the deep sea mud. The worm became a snake, the snake a fish, the fish a mammal, and so on. Is not this very idea at the bottom of Darwin's theory when he maintains that the organic forms have their origin in more simple species? And he says that the structureless protoplasm born in the mud of the Laurentian and Silurian periods and the Manu's mud of the seas, I dare say, gradually transformed itself into the anthropoid ape and finally into the human being. We said it looked very much like it. But in spite of all that, my respect for Darwin and his eminent follower Haeckel, I cannot agree with their final conclusions, especially with the conclusions of the latter, concluded Shamrawa. This hasty and bilious German is perfectly accurate in copying the embryology of Manu and all the metamorphoses of our ancestors, but he forgets the evolution of the human soul, which, as is stated by Manu, goes hand in hand with the evolution of matter. The son of Swayambhuva, the self-becoming, speaks as follows. Everything is created in a new cycle in addition to the qualities of its preceding transmigrations, acquires new qualities, and the nearer it approaches to man, the higher type of the earth, the brighter becomes the divine spark. But once it has become a Brahma, it will enter the cycle of conscious transmigrations. Do you realize what that means? It means that from this very moment, its transformations depend no longer on the blind laws of gradual evolution, but on the least of man's actions, which brings either a reward or a punishment. Now you see that it depends on man's will, whether on the one hand he will start on the way to moksha, the eternal bliss, passing from one loka to another till he reaches Brahmaloka, or on the other, owing to his sins, he will be thrown back. You know that the average soul, once freed from earthly reincarnations, has to ascend from one loka to another, always in the human shape, though this shape will grow and perfect itself with every loka. Some of our sects understood these lokas to mean certain stars. These spirits, freed from earthly matter, are what we mean by Pitris, Pitris, and Devas, whom we worship. And did not your Kabbalists in the Middle Ages designate these Pitris under the expression planetary spirits? But in the case of a very sinful man, he will have to begin once more with the animal forms which he already traversed unconsciously. Both Darwin and Haeckel lose sight of this, so to speak. Second volume in their incomplete theory, but still neither of them advances any argument to prove it false. Is it not so? Neither of them does anything of the sort, most assuredly. Why, in this case, exclaimed he, suddenly changing his colloquial tone for an aggressive one, why am I who have studied the most modern ideas of Western science, I who believe in its representatives, why am I suspected prey by Miss X of belonging to the tribe of the ignorant and the superstitious Hindus? Why does she think that our perfected scientific theories are superstitions, and we ourselves a fallen inferior race? Shamrao stood before us with tears in his eyes. We were at a loss as to what to answer him, being confused to the last degree by this outburst. Mind you, I do not proclaim our popular beliefs to be infallible dogmas. I consider them to be mere theories, and try to the best of my ability to reconcile the ancient and the modern science. I formulate hypotheses just like Darwin and Haeckel. Besides, if I understood rightly, Miss X is a spiritualist, so she believes in Bhutas, Bhutas, and believing that a Bhuta is capable of penetrating the body of a medium, how can she deny that a Bhuta, and more so a less sinful soul, may enter the body of a vampire bat? I own this logic was a little too condensed for us, and so, avoiding a direct answer to a metaphysical question of such delicacy, we tried to apologize and excuse Miss X's rudeness as well we could. She did not mean to offend you, we said. She only replied in a calumny familiar to every European. Besides, if she had taken the trouble to think it over, she probably would not have said it. Little by little, we succeeded in pacifying our host. He recovered his usual cheerfulness, but could not resist the temptation of adding a few words to his long argumentation. He had just begun to reveal to us certain peculiarities of his late brother's character, which induced him to be prepared, judging by the laws of atavism, to see their repetition in the propensity of a vampire bat, when Mr. Y suddenly dashed in on our small group and spoiled all the results of our conciliatory words by screaming at the top of his voice, "The old woman has gone demented. She keeps on cursing us and saying that the murder of this wretched bat is only the forerunner of a whole series of misfortunes brought on her house by you, Shamrao," said he, hastily addressing the bewildered follower of Haeckel. "She says, you have polluted your Brahmanical holiness by inviting us. Colonel, you'd better send for the elephants. In another moment, all this crowd will be upon us." "For goodness sakes," exclaimed Shamrao, poor Shamrao, "have some consideration for my feelings. She's an old woman. She has some superstitions, but she is my mother. You are educated people, learned people. Advise me. Show me a way out of these difficulties. What would you do in my place?" "What would I do, sir?" exclaimed Mr. Y, completely put out of temper by this utter lucid lucrousness, I don't know, I can't pronounce this word, of our awkward predicament. "What would I do? Were I a man in your position and a believer in all that you were brought up to believe, I would take my revolver in the first place, shoot all the vampire bats in the neighborhood, if only to get rid of your late relations from abject bodies of these creatures, and in the second place I would endeavor to smash the head of the conceited fraud in the shape of a Brahmin who invented all this stupid story. That's what I would do, sir." But this advice did not content the miserable descendant of Rama. No doubt, he would have remained a long time undecided as to what course of action to adopt, torn as he was between the sacred feelings of hospitality and the innate fear of the Brahmin priest and his own superstitions, if our ingenious Babu had not come to our rescue. Learning that we all felt more or less indignant at all this row, that we were preparing to leave the house as quickly as possible, he persuaded us to stay, if only for an hour, saying that our hasty departure would be a terrible outrage upon our host, whom, in any case, we could not find fault with. As to the stupid old woman, the Babu promised us to pacify her speedily enough. He had his own plans and views. In the meantime, he said, we better go and examine the ruins of the old fortress close by. We obeyed very reluctantly, feeling an acute interest in his plans in quotes. We proceeded slowly. Our gentlemen were visibly out of temper. Miss X tried to calm herself by taking more than usual. No, by talking more than usual. And Narayan, as phlegmatic as usual, indolently and good-naturedly chaffed her about her beloved spirits. Glancing back, we saw that Babu, accompanied by the family priest. Judging by their gestures, they were engaged in some warm discussion. The shaven head of the Brahmin nodded right and left, his yellow garment flapping in the wind, and his arms rose towards the sky as if in an appeal to the gods to come down and testify to the truth of his words. I'll bet you $1,000 no plans of our Babu's will be of any avail with this fanatic, confidently remarked the colonel as he lit his pipe. But we had hardly walked 100 steps after this remark when we saw the Babu running after us and signaling us to stop. Everything ended first rate, he screamed as soon as we could hear. You are to be thanked. You happen to be the true saviors and benefactors of the deceased Buddha. You! Our Babu sank on the ground, holding his narrow, panting breast with both hands, laughed till we all burst into laughter too, before learning anything at all. Think of it, began Babu, and stopped short, preventing from going on by his exuberant hilarity. Just think of it. The whole transaction is to cost me only 10 rupees. I offered 5 at first, but he would not. He said this was a sacred matter, but 10, he could not resist. At last we learned the story. All the metempsychoses depend on the imagination of the family gurus, who receive for their kind offices from 100 to 150 rupees a year. Every rite is accompanied by more or less considerable addition to the purse of the insatiable family Brahmin. But the happy events pay better than the sad ones. Knowing all this, the Babu asked the Brahmin point blank to perform a false samadhi, that is to say, to feign an inspiration and to announce to the sorrowing mother that her late son's will had acted consciously in all the circumstances, that he longed for death in order to attain a higher position in the animal kingdom, and that he is happy and that he is deeply indebted to the Sahib who broke his neck and so freed him from his abject embodiment. Besides, the observant eye of our all-knowing Babu had not failed to remark that a she-buffalo on the gurus was expecting a calf, and that the guru was yearning to sell it to Shamrao. This circumstance was a trump card in the Babu's hand. Let the guru announce under the influence of samadhi that the freed spirit intends to inhabit the body of the future baby buffalo, and the old lady will buy the new incarnation of her firstborn as sure as the sun is bright. This announcement will be followed by rejoicings and new rites. And who will profit by all this, if not the family priest? At first, the guru had some misgivings and swore by everything sacred that the vampire bat was veritably inhabited by the brother of Shamrao, but the Babu knew better than to give in. The guru ended by understanding that his skillful opponent saw through his tricks, and that he was well aware of the Shastras, that the Shastras exclude the possibility of such transmigration. Growing alarmed, the guru also grew meek and asked only 10 rupees and a promise of silence for the performance of a samadhi. On our way back, we met at the gate by Shamrao, who was simply radiant. Whether he was afraid of our laughing at him, or he was at a loss to find an explanation of his new metamorphosis in the positive sciences in general, and Haeckel in particular, he did not attempt to explain why the affair had taken such an unexpectedly good turn. He merely mentioned awkwardly enough that his mother, owing to some mysterious conjectures of hers, had dismissed all sad apprehensions as to the destiny of her elder son, and then he dropped the subject completely. In order to wipe away the traces of the morning's perplexities from our minds, Shamrao invited us to sit on the veranda by the wide entrance of his idol room. Whilst the family prayers were going on, nothing could suit us better. It was 9 o'clock, the usual time of the morning prayers. Shamrao went to the well to get ready and to dress himself, as he said, though the process was more like undressing. In a few moments he came back wearing only a dhuti, D-H-U-T-I, as during dinner time, and with his head uncovered. He went straight to his idol room, and the moment he entered, we heard the loud stroke of a bell that hung under the ceiling, and that continued tolling all the time the prayers lasted. The Babu explained to us that a little boy was pulling the bell rope from the roof. Shamrao stepped in with his right foot, and very slowly. Then he approached the altar and sat on a little stool with his legs crossed. At the opposite side of the room, on the red velvet shelves of the altar that resembled an atager, E accent acute, T-A-G-E accent grave, R-E. In the drawing room of some fashionable lady stood many idols. They were made of gold, of silver, of brass, of marble, according to their importance and merits. Mahadeva, so M-A-H-A--D-E-V-A, Mahadeva or Shiva was of gold, Gunpati or Ganesha of silver, Vishnu in the form of a round black stone from the river Gandaki in Nepal. In this form, Vishnu was called Lakshmi Narayan. There were also many other gods unknown to us, who were worshipped in the shapes of big shells called Chakra, Surya, the god of the sun, and the Kula Devas, K-U-L-A Devas, the domestic gods, were placed in the second rank. The altar was sheltered by a cupola of carved sandalwood. During the night, the gods and the offerings were covered by a huge glass bell. On the walls there were many sacred images representing the chief episodes in the biographies of the higher gods. Shamrao filled his left hand with ashes, murmuring prayers all the while, covering it for a second with the right one, and then put some matter to the ashes, and mixing the two by rubbing his hands together, he traced a line on his face with this mixture by moving the thumb of his right hand from his nose upward, and then from the middle of the forehead to the right temple, and then back again to the left temple. Having done with his face, he proceeded to cover with wet ashes his throat, arms, shoulders, back, head, and ears. In one corner of the room stood a huge bronze font filled with water. Shamrao made straight to it and plunged into it 3 times, Dhuti, D-H-U-T-I, head and all, after which he came out looking exactly like a well-formed, dripping, wet Triton. He twisted the only lock of hair on top of his shaved head and sprinkled it with water. This operation concluded the first act. The second act began with religious meditations and with mantras, which, by really pious people, must be repeated 3 times a day, at sunrise, at noon, and at sunset. Shamrao loudly pronounced the names of the 24 gods, and each name was accompanied by a stroke of the bell. Having finished his first Having finished, he first shut his eyes and stuffed his ears with cotton, then pressed his left nostril with 2 fingers of his left hand, and having filled his lungs with the air through the right nostril, pressed the latter also. Then he tightly closed his lips so that breathing became impossible. In this position, every pious Hindu must mentally repeat a certain verse, which is called the Gayatri, Gayatri. These are sacred words which no Hindu will dare to pronounce aloud. Even in repeating them mentally, he must take every precaution not to inhale anything impure. I am bound by my word of honor never to repeat the whole of this prayer, but I may quote a few unconnected sentences. And here's a quote. Earth, heaven, let the adored light of. And here follows a name which must not be pronounced. Shelter me. Let thy Son, O thou only one, shelter me, the unworthy. I shut my eyes, I shut my ears, I do not breathe, in order to see, hear, and breathe thee alone. Throw light upon our thoughts. And then again the secret name. End of quote. And I'm sorry if I said that all wrong. I don't know how this prayer was really, incantated. Is that the word? It is curious to compare this Hindu prayer with the celebrated prayers of Descartes' meditation number 3 in his L'existence de Dieu, the existence of God. It runs as follows, if I remember rightly. Now I shut my eyes, cover my ears, and dismiss all my 5 senses. I will dwell on the thought of God alone. I will meditate on his quality and look on the beauty of this wondrous radiancy. After this prayer, Shamrao read many other prayers, holding with his 2 fingers his sacred Brahmanical thread. After a while began the ceremony of the washing of the gods. Taking them down from the altar, one after another, according to their rank, Shamrao first plunged them in the big font with which he had just bathed himself, and then bathed them in milk in a smaller bronze font by the altar. The milk was mixed up with curds, butter, honey, and sugar, so it cannot be said that this cleansing served its purpose. No wonder we were glad to see that the gods underwent a second bathing in the first font when they were dried with a clean towel. And then they were dried with a clean towel. When the gods were arranged in their respective places, the Hindu traced on them the sectarian signs with a ring from his left hand. He used white sandal paint for the lingam and the red for the Ganpati and Surya, and he sprinkled them with aromatic oils and covered them with fresh flowers. The long ceremony was finished by the awakening of the gods. A small bell was repeatedly rung under the noses of the idols, who, as the Brahmin probably supposed, all went to sleep during this tedious ceremony. Having noticed or fancied, which amounts to the same thing, that they were wide awake, he began offering them his daily sacrifices, lighting the incense and the lamps, and to our great astonishment, snapping his fingers from time to time, as if warning the idols to look out. Having filled the room with clouds of incense and fumes of burning camphor, he scattered some more flowers over the altar and sat on a small stool for a while, murmuring the last prayers. He repeatedly held the palms of his hands over the flame of tapers and rubbed his face with them. Then he walked around the altar 3 times, and having knelt 3 times, retreated backward to the door. After a little while, before our host had finished his morning prayers, the ladies of the house came into the room. They brought each a small stool and sat in a row, murmuring prayers and telling the beads of their rosaries. The part played by the rosaries in India is as important as in all Buddhist countries. Every god has his favorite flower and his favorite material for a rosary. The fakirs are simply covered with rosaries. The rosary is called mala and consists of 108 beads. Very pious Hindus are not content to tell the beads while praying. They must hide their hands during this ceremony in a bag called gomukha, Gomukha, which means the cow's mouth. We left the women to their prayers and followed our host to the cow house. The cow symbolizes the fostering earth or nature and is worshipped accordingly. Shamrao sat down by the cow and washed her feet, first with her own milk, then with water. He gave her some sugar and rice, covered her forehead with powdered sandal, and adorned her horns and forelegs with chains of flowers. He burned some incense under her nostrils and brandished a burning lamp over her head. Then he walked 3 times around her and sat down to rest. Some Hindus walk around the cow 108 times, rosary in hand, but our Shamrao had a slight tendency to free thinking, as we knew, and besides, he was too much of an admirer of Haeckel. Having rested himself, he filled a cup with water and put in it the cow's tail for a moment and then drank it. After this, he performed the rite of worshipping the sun and the sacred plant Tulsi, Tulsi. Unable to bring the god Surya from his heavenly altar and to wash him in the sacred font, Shamrao contented himself by filling his own mouth with water, standing on one leg and spurting water towards the sun. Needless to say, it never reached the orb of the day, but very unexpectedly sprinkled us instead. It is still a mystery to us why the plant Tulsi, Royal Basilicum, is worshipped. However, towards the end of September, we yearly witnessed the strange ceremony of the wedding of this plant with the god Vishnu, notwithstanding that Tulsi bears the title of Krishna's bride, probably because of the latter being an incarnation of Vishnu. On these occasions, pots of this plant are painted and adorned with tinsel. A magical circle is traced in the garden and the plant is put in the middle of it. A Brahmin brings an idol of Vishnu and begins the marriage ceremony standing before the plant. A married couple hold a shawl between the plant and the god as if screening them from each other. The Brahmin utters prayers, and young women, especially unmarried girls, who are the most ardent worshippers of Tulsi, throw rice and saffron over the idol and the plant. When the ceremony is concluded, the Brahmin is presented with the shawl. The idol is put in the shade of his wife. The Hindus clap their hands and rend everyone's ears with the noise of tom-toms, let off fireworks, offer each other pieces of sugar cane, and rejoice in every conceivable way till the dawn of the next day. And that concludes that chapter. Wow. Well, that was certainly interesting. The next chapter is going to be called A Witch's Den, so that should be very interesting. Till soon.